Imagine this. It's November 1992, a night that would change everything. Dale Hoffman, a truck driver, sits alone in his idling Peterbilt, parked at a Texaco station on Route 287. Minutes later, he pulls away, only to vanish without a trace. No wreckage, no accident. He's gone. His wife is told he's run off. His daughter is left wondering why he abandoned them. For 20 years, his family mourns, believing he chose to leave. But then, in 2012, a chilling discovery shakes the foundation of everything they thought they knew. A team of divers finds Dale's truck at the bottom of a quarry, perfectly preserved, with his body still strapped in the seat. And that's when the truth begins to unravel. An unexpected betrayal, a deadly conspiracy, and a story of murder that had been buried underwater for 2 decades. The question remains, why did Dale Hoffman have to die? And who was really behind his disappearance? If you're captivated by this mystery and want to uncover more, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this story with friends who love gripping true crime tales. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Dale Hoffman's life as a long-haul truck driver seemed unremarkable. He had built a career driving across Texas, spending more time on the road than at home, but this time, something was different. November 8, 1992 was a regular evening. Dale stopped for a break at the Texaco station on Route 287, preparing for the last stretch of his journey. The machine parts he was hauling were bound for Dallas. He sat in the cab of his Peterbilt, watching the night pass by, the soft hum of the engine as comforting as it was familiar. After a short break, he decided to leave. 20 minutes later, Dale climbed back into his truck, adjusted his seat, and started the engine. The quiet air filled the truck cabin as he pulled out of the station lot, heading toward the highway. That was the last anyone saw of Dale Hoffman. His truck, his cargo, and his destination, Dallas, were all abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no crash, no wreckage. It was as if he had disappeared. His wife, Larry, was first to hear the news. Her husband hadn't arrived at his next stop, and no one could explain why. It didn't take long before rumors started to circulate. Maybe he had run off. The authorities began their search immediately. For months, the investigation turned up nothing. No leads, no trace of where Dale had gone. He had simply vanished without a trace, as if swallowed by the earth. As weeks passed, the insurance company launched their own investigation. Larry was told to prepare for the worst. There were whispers in the town about Dale's secret life. Some even suggested he had a woman waiting elsewhere. But Larry knew better. She refused to believe her husband would abandon her and their son, Emmett. She clung to the hope that something, anything, would explain why Dale had suddenly disappeared. 8 months passed, and the search slowed down. The insurance company paid out $700,000, settling the claim under the assumption that Dale had left of his own accord. Larry, broken but pragmatic, moved on with her life. Emmett, who was only 8 years old at the time, grew up with the belief that his father had chosen to leave them. The absence was something he had to accept, a puzzle he couldn't solve. Years went by. Emmett lived through the anger, the confusion, and the growing ache of his father's disappearance. He learned to push the memory of Dale to the back of his mind, letting the years dull the pain. Then, in 2012, something happened. The town's garrison quarry, which had been out of use for decades, began draining for industrial expansion. No one knew that it would soon unveil the most chilling discovery of Emmett's life. As the construction crews worked, they found something unexpected at the bottom of the quarry. A vehicle, Dale's Peterbilt truck, preserved by the airless water. The truck was undisturbed, as if it had been parked there just days ago. Inside the truck was a horrifying sight, Dale's body still strapped to the driver's seat. He had been dead for 20 years. The shock of the discovery rippled through the small town, and everything changed in an instant. Emmett's world shattered. His father had not run off. He hadn't abandoned his family. No, something much darker had happened. Someone had killed him, and for 2 decades, that truth had remained hidden. It wasn't just the discovery of the truck that was unsettling. There was a receipt found in Dale's jacket. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Someone had been with him, and that someone knew the quarry well. As the investigation picked up again, Emmett found himself thrust back into the life he thought he had left behind. His questions were no longer about why his father left, but who had taken his life, and why. In 2012, Garrison Quarry was preparing for an industrial expansion that would change the landscape of the area. The old, unused quarry was being drained for the first time in decades, setting the stage for something unexpected. Emmett had heard rumors that the quarry was being drained, but he paid little attention. After all, the quarry had been empty for as long as he could remember. Nothing remarkable ever came from it. Then, everything changed. When construction crews began working, they made an unexpected discovery. At the bottom of the quarry, buried under layers of silt and water, they found a truck. Not just any truck, Dale's Peterbilt. The truck was eerily intact. It looked like it had been parked just days earlier, despite being submerged for 20 years. The airless environment had preserved much of the truck, and most shockingly, Dale's body was still strapped to the driver's seat. The medical examiner called to the scene made a stunning observation. Dale had been murdered. The bullet wound was small, likely from a .22 caliber gunshot, and it was located at the back of his skull. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Emmett couldn't believe it. His father, the man who had disappeared without a trace, had been murdered. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a crime that had remained hidden for 2 decades. The most chilling part of the discovery wasn't just the body, but the receipt found in Dale's jacket. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, one for Dale and the other for someone else, someone who had been with him that night. Emmett's heart raced as he read the timestamp on the receipt, 11:47 p.m. That was the night his father had disappeared. The discovery immediately raised questions. Who had been with him? Why was this person involved? The quarry had been closed for years, and no one had any reason to go there, yet the truck had been carefully hidden at the bottom as though someone had known exactly where to place it to keep it out of sight. The more Emmett thought about it, the more questions flooded his mind. Why would someone want to kill his father? What was the motive behind the crime? Emmett had lived with the pain of believing his father had left, but this was something entirely different. As the investigation deepened, the sheriff's department started to uncover more details. It wasn't just a random crime. It was clear that someone had orchestrated this murder with a level of planning that made the whole thing feel like a carefully executed scheme. Emmett's thoughts raced as he pieced together the details: the receipt, the carefully hidden truck, and the fact that Dale's body had been preserved for 2 decades. Someone had made sure that the truth wouldn't come to light for years. The most puzzling part of the discovery was the quiet, almost forgotten quarry. Why had this specific location been chosen? Why not a more obvious place? The answer seemed to be buried in the secrecy of the place itself. For Emmett, the discovery was both a nightmare and a revelation. It shattered everything he had believed about his father. His father hadn't run away. No, his father had been murdered, and the person responsible was still out there. The sheriff's office began to reopen the case, scouring through old records and questioning anyone who might have known Dale's whereabouts that night. Everything was being re-examined, and everyone who had been connected to Dale's life was now under scrutiny. Emmett found himself pulled back into a world he thought he had left behind. But now, with the discovery of the truck and the body, everything was different. The past was no longer just a story of abandonment. It was a mystery he had to solve. As the investigation continued, Emmett began to uncover shocking truths about his father's business partner, Carl Briggs. The man who had been like family to them had a dark side that no one could have imagined. The discovery of the truck in Garrison Quarry marked the beginning of a journey into a world of betrayal, lies, and murder that Emmett would never have expected. His father's death was no accident, and Emmett was determined to find out who was responsible. The search for answers had just begun, and Emmett knew that the road ahead would be full of revelations that would forever change his understanding of the past. But there was one thing he was certain of. Someone had to pay for his father's death. Emmett's life was never the same after that day. The discovery of his father's body in the quarry left him with more questions than answers. He couldn't escape the growing sense of disbelief. His days were filled with confusion and anger. How could his father have been murdered and hidden away for so long? Why had everyone believed he simply walked away from his family? It didn't make sense. Then, just as he thought he might get some closure, the phone call came. Emmett was at work, sorting through paint samples, when the number on his phone screen startled him. The area code was local. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another sales call. But something inside urged him to pick up. "Emmett Hoffman," he answered, his voice strained with the weight of the past few days. A calm voice on the other end of the line responded, "Emmett, this is Sheriff Tom Garrett. I need you to sit down." The words hit Emmett like a physical blow. His heart raced. What now? "I've got some news about your father," Sheriff Garrett continued, his voice low. "You need to brace yourself." Emmett's hands shook. He could feel his world beginning to crumble once again. It was happening all over again. Emmett couldn't help but laugh, a nervous, hollow sound. "I'm at work." "What is it, Sheriff? What's going on?" He already knew something terrible was coming. His stomach knotted, a familiar feeling of dread sinking in. The words that followed seemed impossible. "We found your father, Emmett. His truck, his body. It's all here. We need you to come down." The paint samples slipped from his hand, scattering like confetti across the floor. The world around him faded for a moment. All he could hear was the ringing in his ears. His father had been found, but it wasn't a happy reunion. It was the discovery of a crime long buried. I don't understand," Emmett whispered, struggling to process the flood of emotions crashing over him, the grief, the anger, the guilt. It was all too much. His father wasn't lost. He had been murdered. Sheriff Garrett's voice softened. "I know this is a lot to take in, but we need you to come to the office. We need to talk about what we found." The sheriff was trying to sound reassuring, but Emmett heard the urgency in his tone. I don't know if I can do this," Emmett muttered, feeling weak. How could he walk into a room and face the reality that his father had been killed, murdered, and discarded like a piece of trash? But something inside him clicked. This was the moment he had been dreading. The moment when the truth would finally be laid bare. The moment he had to face it no matter how much it hurt. "I'll be there," Emmett said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, trying to catch his breath. This was the start of something he wasn't ready for. As Emmett drove to the sheriff's office, he felt like a man walking toward his own fate. The world outside seemed strangely quiet. His mind raced, going over the events of the past few days, the questions that still haunted him. How could his father have been murdered? Why hadn't anyone told him the truth? What had Carl, his father's best friend, been hiding? Emmett felt a rising sense of dread. Was Carl involved in all of this? When he arrived at the sheriff's office, he felt like an outsider, as though he didn't belong there. The air was thick with tension. Sheriff Garrett was waiting for him, his face drawn and serious. "You okay, Emmett?" he asked, his voice full of sympathy. Emmett didn't answer at first. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded slowly, trying to compose himself. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was afraid of the answer, afraid of what he might see. Sheriff Garrett led him down a narrow hallway, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly. As they reached the morgue, Emmett's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment he would have to face his father's death. Inside the room, a young medical examiner stood by a stainless steel table. A blue sheet covered the body, but Emmett didn't need to see more to know who it was. The shape of the man beneath the sheet was unmistakable. The medical examiner hesitated before she pulled back the sheet, revealing Dale Hoffman's face. Emmett's breath caught in his throat. His father looked strangely peaceful, but it wasn't the peace of sleep. It was the stillness of death. "That's him," Emmett said quietly, his voice breaking. He reached out a trembling hand, touching the edge of the table. This was his father. The man he had thought abandoned him. The man he had spent 20 years trying to understand. Sheriff Garrett nodded, a somber expression on his face. "We found a bullet wound in the back of his skull," he said, his voice low. "It looks like he was murdered before the truck went into the water." The words hit Emmett like a punch to the gut. "I can't believe it," Emmett whispered, his chest tight. He had grown up thinking his father had left him. But this was different. This wasn't abandonment. This was murder. Emmett's mind raced. Why had someone done this to his father? Who had killed him? And why? The mystery deepened, and the answers felt farther away than ever. The discovery had cracked open a world of pain that Emmett wasn't ready to confront. Emmett's mind raced as he left the sheriff's office. His father's body was found, but that discovery only raised more questions, the most pressing of which was Carl Briggs, his father's longtime business partner. Carl had been like an uncle to Emmett, the man who showed up at family gatherings, who helped out after Dale disappeared. He had even been there for Emmett's birthdays, giving gifts and offering support. But now, as the case deepened, Carl was starting to look less like the loving family friend and more like a suspect. Emmett couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Carl. Sheriff Garrett had mentioned Carl's name during their meeting. Emmett's suspicions grew stronger. Carl was the one person who had been closest to his father, and yet his actions since Dale's disappearance were starting to look suspicious. Carl had sold the trucking business soon after Dale vanished, using the insurance money from Dale's disappearance to buy a house on Lake Buchanan. It was odd that Carl had never questioned the sudden windfall. Emmett knew that Carl had been struggling with debt for years. He'd always been tight-lipped about his finances, but Emmett never imagined it was bad enough for Carl to betray his best friend, his father. A growing suspicion gnawed at Emmett as he dug through old records. He found a strange pattern of unexplained payments from Carl to various people, mostly local gamblers and shady business figures. Was Carl running from something, or hiding something? The more Emmett learned about Carl, the less he liked what he saw. There were whispers of Carl's gambling addiction, his connections to people who didn't look like the kind of company Dale would keep. Then Emmett found a receipt that made his heart skip. It was dated from November 8, 1992, the same night Dale had disappeared. It was a purchase of 1 coffee and 1 sandwich. The time? 10:15 p.m. The location? Texaco Station. Emmett knew it wasn't his father's receipt. Dale never bought just one of anything, let alone a sandwich. He always bought 2, one for himself and one for someone else. And that someone was Carl. This was the moment Emmett knew for sure. Carl had been with his father that night. But why? Why would Carl be involved in something so sinister? Emmett's thoughts raced, but he couldn't come to any conclusion that made sense. Sheriff Garrett was quick to draw connections between Carl and the scene at the quarry. The angle of the bullet wound, the preserved body in the truck, it all pointed to someone close to Dale, someone who knew him well. Emmett felt like he was drowning in the weight of the new revelations. He couldn't believe that Carl, the man who had been like a second father to him, could have been involved in his real father's murder. It didn't make sense. But then, as he sat in his car staring at the Texaco station, it all started to fall into place. The receipt, Carl's shady business deals, the missing logbook, all of it connected. Carl had been involved from the very beginning. It wasn't just about money, there was something deeper here. Emmett knew that Carl had been struggling with more than just debts. He was caught in a web of desperation, and Emmett feared that his father had been part of that trap. Sheriff Garrett confirmed Emmett's suspicions when they spoke again. Carl was in over his head, he said, his voice grim. He was desperate, and when Dale refused to help him cover the debts, he saw no other way out. The revelation hit Emmett like a ton of bricks. His father, the man who had always done the right thing, had been caught in the crossfire of Carl's actions. Dale's sense of loyalty to Carl had led him to his death. Carl's confession would come later, but Emmett wasn't ready for it yet. The truth was too much to bear. He had spent 2 decades grieving a man who had never abandoned him. His father hadn't chosen to leave. He had been murdered. Emmett's head spun as the investigation gained momentum. More and more evidence pointed to Carl as the mastermind behind the murder. The motive was clear. Carl had needed the insurance money to cover his debts. But there was more to it. The sheriff's department discovered that Carl had been trying to convince Dale to fake his disappearance for years. Carl had been planning the murder for months, but it wasn't until the day of the truck run that he finally made his move. It was all coming together in a way that was both shocking and heartbreaking. The betrayal cut deep. Emmett didn't know how to feel. His anger was boiling over, but there was a part of him that wanted to understand. As Emmett prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Carl, he knew that the truth would set him free, but it would also destroy him in the process. The man he had trusted had taken everything from him, including his father's life. As the investigation into Dale's murder continued, Emmett found himself deep in the tangled web of lies and deceit that had been spun over the years. The truth about his father's death was slowly surfacing. Sheriff Garrett's office had been busy going through all the evidence that had been uncovered so far, but there was still so much more to dig through. Everything pointed to Carl's involvement, but they needed concrete proof. It wasn't just the truck and the receipt found in Dale's jacket. The more Emmett looked into Carl's finances, the clearer it became that Carl had been struggling with gambling debts, making desperate choices to save himself. The first major breakthrough came when the sheriff's office recovered an old trucker's logbook, not Dale's last one, but one from October 1992. It was clear that Carl was involved in some shady dealings at the time. The logbook revealed something unsettling. In the margins, Dale had written notes about Carl's gambling problems, about how Carl had asked about life insurance policies and mentioned a need for money. Dale had been worried. Carl's financial troubles were deeper than anyone had realized. He owed thousands of dollars to dangerous people, money that had been spent on gambling, not the trucking business. This was about more than just debts. It was about survival. Sheriff Garrett had made an unexpected discovery when he pulled Carl's old phone records. Calls were made to various shady individuals around the time of Dale's disappearance. These weren't just business calls. They were calls to people who had been linked to Carl's debts. The more they looked into Carl's past, the more suspicious it became. There were multiple references to Tony Castellano, a man with a criminal background, involved in money laundering and the drug trade. Carl had been entangled in that world. This wasn't just about a missing person or a tragic disappearance anymore. It was about murder, manipulation, and betrayal on a scale Emmett hadn't fully grasped. The evidence was mounting, and Carl's role in it was undeniable. Emmett felt the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. His father's death had been an accident for no one, but it was a well-planned crime, carefully executed by someone he had trusted completely. Someone like Carl. The deeper they dug, the more they found. Insurance documents surfaced, showing that Carl had been a beneficiary of a life insurance policy, one that had been changed just days before Dale's death. It seemed too convenient to be a coincidence. Carl had tried to get Dale to sign the policy changes in the weeks leading up to the murder. Dale had refused, but Carl had pushed him harder than anyone realized. This wasn't just a business issue. It was life or death for Carl. There were multiple receipts and bank statements that showed Carl had been making unusual payments during the months before Dale's death. The timing of these transactions matched perfectly with the night Dale disappeared. Everything was pointing in one direction. As the pieces fell into place, Emmett couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disbelief. Carl had been planning this all along. The man who had been like a second father to him had orchestrated the death of his own best friend. Carl's desperation had led him down a dark path. He had seen his only way out through murder, believing it was the only way to save himself and his family from financial ruin. Emmett had never imagined it would go this far. Sheriff Garrett had collected all the evidence, but it was still hard for Emmett to fully accept the truth. Carl wasn't just involved in Dale's death. He had been the one who had pulled the trigger. He had killed his best friend for money. Emmett stood at the edge of the investigation, unsure of how to feel. This was his father's story, but it was also his own. The betrayal was too much to bear, and yet, the truth was finally becoming clear. As the case gained momentum, Emmett knew there was only one thing left to do. They had to confront Carl. But Emmett wasn't sure if he was ready to face the man who had taken so much from him, so much from their family. The truth about Dale's death was now undeniable, but it had come at a steep cost. Emmett had learned things about Carl, his father's best friend, that he could never forget. The line between family and betrayal had blurred. The investigation had reached its critical point. Sheriff Garrett and Emmett had enough evidence to confront Carl, and they knew this was the moment that would define the entire case. The truth was close. Carl was quiet when they arrived at his lake house. The house, once a symbol of success and escape, now felt like a prison. The pristine exterior concealed the darkness inside, the weight of his guilt. Emmett stood beside Sheriff Garrett, his hands trembling as they approached Carl. He had known Carl for most of his life, but the man in front of him was a stranger, a murderer in disguise. Carl greeted them with his usual forced smile, but Emmett could see the fear in his eyes. The facade of calmness was slipping away. He knew why they were here, and he knew it wouldn't end well. "I suppose you want answers," Carl said, his voice cold and clipped. He had always been a man of few words, but now there was something different, something more guarded in the way he spoke. Sheriff Garrett wasted no time. "We know what you did, Carl. We have the receipts, the records, and the evidence to prove it. We know you were involved in Dale's death. And now, we need you to confess." Carl looked at them for a long moment, his eyes shifting between Garrett and Emmett. It was clear he was fighting a battle within himself, trying to decide if he would continue to lie or face the consequences. Emmett's heart raced as he stood there, waiting for Carl to speak. This was it, the moment he had feared for so long. The truth, as painful as it was finally coming to light. Carl had to confess. Carl let out a long sigh and lowered his head, clearly defeated. "I never wanted this to happen," he said quietly. "I didn't want it to go this far, but I was desperate. I had no other choice." Emmett's throat tightened as he listened to Carl's words. For years he had looked up to this man. Carl had been the one to comfort him after his father's disappearance, and now, here he was, admitting to murder. "I was in debt, Emmett," Carl continued, his voice breaking. "I owed money to the wrong people, gamblers, criminals, people who would have destroyed everything I had if I didn't pay them back. I thought I could fix it." Sheriff Garrett leaned in, his expression hardening. "And you thought murdering your best friend was the solution?" His voice was sharp, cutting through Carl's guilt with a raw intensity. "That's your answer to everything?" Carl flinched but didn't look up. "It wasn't like that," he whispered. "I never meant for Dale to die. I didn't want to kill him. But when he wouldn't cooperate, I had no choice. I had to make him disappear. Emmett clenched his fists, his mind swirling with anger and confusion. His father had been loyal to Carl, trusted him completely, and yet Carl had been willing to betray that trust for money, money that had ultimately cost Dale his life. Carl's face twisted with regret as he spoke again. Dale wouldn't sign the papers. I asked him to help me with the insurance money, to fake his disappearance, but he wouldn't do it. He said he couldn't abandon his family. The confession hit Emmett like a punch to the gut. His father had been trying to help Carl, to guide him through his problems, but Carl had been too blinded by his own desperation to see that. He had chosen greed over loyalty. I didn't want it to end this way, Carl continued, his voice trembling. I thought I could just make him disappear. I never meant to shoot him, but when he refused, I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. Sheriff Garrett stared at Carl, his gaze unwavering. And you thought you could get away with it. That's the worst part. You thought you could murder your best friend, hide the body, and walk away clean. Carl's face flushed with shame. I never thought it would be like this. I thought if I just put the truck in the quarry, I could buy some time. I never imagined they'd find it. Never imagined anyone would come looking. Emmett's heart felt heavy with the weight of Carl's confession. He had known Carl was hiding something, but this was more than just a betrayal. This was the destruction of everything Emmett had believed about loyalty and friendship. Carl paused, as if gathering the strength to say more. I thought I could get away with it. That's why I kept the receipts, kept everything clean. But I knew deep down that the truth would come out. And here we are. Emmett felt sick to his stomach. Carl's confession didn't make the pain any easier to bear. His father had trusted Carl, had believed in him, and now Emmett was left to pick up the pieces of that trust. Sheriff Garrett looked at Emmett, his expression softening. This is it, Emmett. It's over. Carl's confessed. We'll make sure he's held accountable for what he's done. The sheriff's words were final, but they didn't offer the comfort Emmett had hoped for. Carl stood silently, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I'm sorry, Emmett. I'm so sorry for what I've done. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I did, and now I have to live with that. Emmett didn't know what to say. There was nothing Carl could say that would ever change what had happened. His father was gone, and the man who had taken him from Emmett was standing right in front of him, admitting his guilt. You'll have to face the consequences, Carl, Emmett said finally, his voice cold and distant. You took everything from me, my father, my family's peace, everything we had. You don't get to walk away from that. As Sheriff Garrett made the arrest, Emmett watched silently. Carl was taken away, but the weight of his confession lingered in the air, a reminder of the damage that had been done. The truth was out, but the pain would remain. The confession was a turning point, but it didn't bring the closure Emmett had hoped for. Carl was in custody, but the damage had already been done. The betrayal cut deeper than any of them realized. Emmett couldn't shake the image of his father's face, frozen in time, preserved by the water. It haunted him in the quiet moments, a reminder of everything that had been taken from him. His father had been a good man. He spent the following days going through the mountain of evidence that had been collected. But it was hard to look at it all. Each receipt, each note, each piece of paper felt like another wound opening. Carl's role in the crime was undeniable. But as Emmett dug deeper, he started to question the people around Carl. Who else was involved? Who else had known what Carl was planning? The questions kept piling up. The more he learned about Carl's connections, the more he realized that this wasn't just a local crime. Carl's debts to dangerous people, his connections to Tony Castellano, and the hidden payments, they were all part of a larger, more sinister story. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Carl hadn't been working alone. He had been manipulated, yes, but by someone much bigger, someone who had orchestrated the whole thing. someone who had used Carl for their own gain. Tony Castellano. The name had come up multiple times in the investigation, and every time it seemed like a dead end. But Emmett now knew that Tony wasn't just a bystander. He was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Sheriff Garrett confirmed Emmett's suspicions when they met again. Carl may have pulled the trigger, but Tony was the one who set the plan in motion. Carl was just a pawn in a much larger game. Emmett felt his blood run cold. The man who had helped destroy his family, the man who had used Carl's addiction to manipulate him, was still out there, untouched, free to live his life while Emmett's father was dead at the bottom of a quarry. "I don't care about Tony," Emmett said quietly. "I need to focus on Carl, on what he did. The rest will come later." But even as he said it, he knew that Tony was the one pulling the strings. The investigation shifted. While Carl's trial was fast approaching, the focus turned to Tony and his network. There were whispers of a larger criminal empire, one that used local businesses like Carl's trucking company as a front for something much darker. The deeper Emmett dug, the more connections he found. Tony had ties to local politicians, shady businessmen, and even law enforcement. It was no wonder the investigation had been so difficult. Tony had buried the truth so deeply. But Emmett wasn't backing down. Carl had betrayed him, but Tony had been the one who had manipulated Carl into killing his father. Emmett knew that the only way to move forward was to take down Tony once and for all. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. The investigation hit roadblocks, and people were reluctant to talk. But slowly, Emmett gathered the pieces. He spoke to witnesses, pieced together records, and uncovered more about Tony's criminal activities. Sheriff Garrett was with him every step of the way, though Emmett could tell the sheriff was starting to grow weary. This was a fight much bigger than either of them had imagined. Tony Castellano wasn't a man you brought down easily. As the investigation moved forward, Emmett felt a growing sense of determination. His father had been betrayed by his closest friend, but he wasn't going to let that betrayal be in vain. He would see justice for his father, no matter the cost. But as the pressure mounted, Carl's role in the story began to shift. He had confessed, yes, but there was something else, something he hadn't told them. As the trial approached, Carl asked to speak with Emmett in private. When they met, Carl was a broken man. His pride had shattered with the confession, but now he seemed truly remorseful. "I never wanted this to happen," Carl said, his voice shaking. "I've been carrying this guilt for so long." Emmett wasn't sure what to say. Carl had murdered his father. He had been complicit in the destruction of Emmett's entire world. But there was something about Carl's demeanor that made Emmett pause. Carl looked at him with tears in his eyes. "I never wanted you to find out this way. I didn't want to kill him. I thought I could fix things, but I was too far gone, too deep in the mess." Emmett's heart felt heavy. He had spent years hating Carl, blaming him for everything that had happened. But now, as Carl sat in front of him, broken and defeated, Emmett realized that the man he had once called Uncle was lost, consumed by his own mistakes. "I know you're angry," Carl continued, "but I need to tell you something before it's too late. Tony was the one who made me do it. He was the one who pushed me. He's the real monster here." Emmett didn't know what to think. Was Carl just trying to save himself? Or was there truth in what he said? Tony Castellano had been a constant shadow over everything, but now Carl's confession added a new layer of complexity. "I'm not going to let you off the hook, Carl," Emmett said quietly. "What you did can't be undone. But if you're really sorry, you need to make things right. You need to help us bring Tony down." Carl nodded slowly, his face a mask of guilt. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't change what happened, but I can help you get justice for Dale." Emmett wasn't sure if he could trust Carl, but he had no choice. The truth about Tony Castellano had to come to light, and Carl might be the key to finally bringing him down. The final betrayal wasn't just Carl's. It was the betrayal of the entire town, of everyone who had believed in the system, in friendship, in loyalty. Tony Castellano had manipulated them all, and now it was time for justice to take its course. Emmett stood at the edge of the quarry, staring at the water below. His father's body had been pulled from these depths, but the truth was still sinking in. The battle for justice wasn't over. The arrest of Carl Briggs was just the beginning, not the end. Emmett knew that Carl's confession had opened doors, but Tony Castellano, the true mastermind, was still free. The fight to expose him had only just begun. Carl had promised to help bring down Tony, but Emmett was cautious. Carl's motives were still unclear, and trusting him was a difficult decision. He had already taken so much from Emmett and his family. As the investigation continued, Sheriff Garrett worked tirelessly, pulling every thread he could find in Tony's criminal network. The walls of corruption ran deep, and every time they thought they were close, a new obstacle appeared. Emmett had never imagined how far-reaching Tony's influence was. He had tentacles in every corner of the town, from the local police force to business owners, even high-ranking officials. Tony had a grip on everything. With Carl's testimony, they had a chance to bring him down. But it was going to take more than just one confession. They needed proof, and they needed people willing to testify against Tony, even at great personal risk. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Tony's men were everywhere, watching, listening. Emmett had been warned that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become for everyone involved. Emmett didn't flinch. He had already lost so much, and he wasn't going to back down now. His father's murder, Carl's betrayal, it all came down to this moment. This reckoning was inevitable. Carl's decision to cooperate made things complicated. He was still a murderer, but now he was playing a role in taking down a much bigger criminal. Emmett had to reconcile the pain of losing his father with the reality of Carl's betrayal. The task ahead was monumental. Tony Castellano wasn't just a local thug, he was a criminal mastermind, capable of manipulating entire systems to avoid justice. It felt like they were fighting an enemy who controlled everything. Then came the breakthrough. Carl had been keeping records, documents that linked Tony to several other murders, money laundering operations, and illegal drug shipments. Carl's knowledge was invaluable, but it was still dangerous to rely on him completely. Emmett felt a surge of hope as the investigators reviewed the evidence. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing a criminal empire that had flourished unchecked for far too long. This was a fight for the future. With every new discovery, the stakes grew higher. Tony's network was vast, and the more they uncovered, the more it became clear how much damage had been done. Emmett knew this wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about the countless lives that had been affected by Tony's crimes. The families destroyed, the people who had been silenced. Tony was a predator, and the reckoning was overdue. This fight wasn't just for Emmett. It was for everyone. The day of the final confrontation arrived. Emmett stood before the evidence, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. His father's murder, Carl's role in it, and the eventual unveiling of Tony's crimes, all of it had led here. They had everything they needed to take down Tony. The trial would be long, but it would be worth it. The evidence was irrefutable, the connections undeniable. Tony Castellano would face justice for his crimes, and Emmett would finally get the truth he had fought for. As the trial began, Emmett sat in the front row, his hands clenched tightly. Carl's testimony was pivotal, but it was Emmett's moment to step forward. He wasn't just seeking justice for his father, he was seeking it for all the victims. Tony sat in the defendant's chair, his cold gaze sweeping the room. He had always thought he was untouchable, invincible. But the walls were closing in, and the reckoning was here. There was nowhere left to hide. The jury listened intently as Carl spoke, his voice filled with regret and guilt. Every word he said exposed Tony's web of lies, his manipulations, and his murders. The truth was coming out, piece by piece. As the evidence mounted, the case against Tony grew stronger. His connections, his influence, his manipulation of Carl, everything had led to this. The final chapter of this long, painful journey was unfolding before Emmett's eyes. Emmett took a deep breath, the weight of the years pressing down on him. His father's murder had been a tragedy, but the reckoning was more than that. It was a moment of truth, of accountability, and of justice finally being served.